Hello, and welcome to People Unfiltered, powered by Ideas Global. I'm your host, Evelyn Espinal. The People Unfiltered podcast is creating the future of inclusion, diversity, equity, activism, and social impact. We deconstruct the myths and failures of DEI, sin pelos en la lengua, to evolve it or a rebirth. We go beyond surface conversations and dive into the hard truths and unspoken realities for deeper discussions with insights and advice. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to People Unfiltered for 2026. I'm your host, Evelyn Espinal, and I'm very pleased to have a very special show for you today. Rather than bringing in an external guest, I've chosen to become the guest, and I'll actually be interviewed on some of my thoughts so that I can give you a perspective on why we started this podcast and what you can expect in the coming year as we continue to evolve our guests and continue to pursue some of the tough topics that other people are afraid to talk about. In our perspective, DEI is democracy. And we started this program because DEI was under attack. So we wanted to make sure that we could put on voices that could really share their point of view, their stance on the importance of DEI. The work that DEI practitioners are doing every day, in our view, that's the work of completing the promise of the Constitution. If we were to stop doing this work, we would see a complete decline in justice, fairness, and equity in our workplaces and in our society. So it's important work. And we want to be able to highlight not only the people that are doing the work, but some of the specific things that they're doing so that we can all learn from each other, stop reinventing the wheel, and try new things to continue to push forward with the value of DEI. Each month, I'm honored to bring with you a conversation with experts and leaders who have strong points of views, but also have their own experience, which may differ from what you may be thinking is the critical elements. So being able to show how many diverse perspectives and approaches there are in this work is another one of the key values that I believe this program offers. As we kick off 2026, I'm taking an opportunity to be in the hot seat myself. And I'd like to answer some of the questions that I usually put to my guests, but also share some of my story. I'd like to introduce to you Maria Nieto. She is the show's executive producer, and I'm so proud to be able to call her a friend and to know that she'll be with me as we continue through this journey. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's been for me such a pleasure and a joy to be the executive producer of this show. Um, every time we have on one of our wonderful guests, I'm inspired. I've given hope. I learn so much each time. And I'm really, really proud of the work that we're doing alongside you. I think you're brilliant. And every time the guests come on, I really take to heart what you said. Really the work that the DEI practitioners are doing are on the front lines. They are democracy. That is the promise of the Constitution. That is how we get created equal. Because if it's just words, then it's not a fulfillment, right? And our guests come on and they bring these different perspectives and these different topics. And it's been such an eye-opener for me to see the many ways that DEI infiltrates really every aspect of life. So I'm excited for the year ahead. I think it's more necessary now than ever. These are not easy times we're living through, but knowing that people like our guests and you and me, quite frankly, are on the front lines, really battling and fighting for what's right and fair and just, gives me hope. And I hope it gives our audience hope as well. So I'm excited for 2026. And I'm excited to share with the audience everything that you are and what you bring to the table and your wonderful, brilliant thought leadership as well. So I'm excited.
Thank you, Maria. I appreciate that. So let's get started. What questions do you have for me?
Well, I'm gonna ask the same question we ask all of our guests, right? Which is, how did you get into this work? What's your background? Like what made you commit so much of your mind and energy and focus and career really on the work of DEI?
Yeah, every time I ask a guest that question, I think about what my answer would be, and it's always different. But I think for today, I'm going to focus on being incredibly young. I was 15 years old, and I was asked to volunteer to actually submit an application to the mayor's office for a new youth council that they were inaugurating. And the idea was to take young people from the five boroughs who would come together and give advice
Mhm.
to commissioners, to deputy mayors, to the mayor himself on the issues that young people were facing, issues around citizenship, around bullying, around racial strife, things that were actually quite heavy for me at the time. And I did the application because I thought, oh, this is going to look good on my college transfer, right? I was young, I was in high school, and I knew that I needed to go to college. And I was also in a commercial high school, which is not one where the majority of those students were pointing to college. They were actually pointing to, administrative work or accounting work. So I wanted to do something different. And the minute that I started working with the mayor's office, I started to see the incredible number of points of views, of conflicts, of things that got in the way of being able to make decisions that I thought were incredibly easy. Why don't you fund the park during the summer and give it funding so that kids have some place to go when they're not in school, right? It's those kinds of questions. And very quickly in that time, there were racial issues happening throughout the city. Um, the thing that sticks out in my mind most clearly were two young brother and sister coming home from school. They were black and they were painted, spray painted white by the kids in the neighborhood. And that was such an affront. There were not full-fledged riots, but there were protests, and there was a lot of focus on schools and what are we doing at school? How are we teaching our children to embrace each other and to accept difference? Shortly after that, there was an incident in Crown Heights, which did lead to riots. And this was when a Jewish driver hit an African American driver, sorry, patrons. And the ambulance that came was from a Jewish institution and refused to take the injured pedestrian and actually ended up taking the driver that was unharmed. And that created a lot of strife because these two communities live so close together in Crown Heights and yet didn't have any interaction with each other. And so the city's government's response to this was to say, how do we educate our children so that they're growing up in an environment where they see different things about each other, things that are more positive, things that bring on coalition building, collaboration, and friendships. And so I worked with consultants from across the city that were putting together workshops and programs. We worked on anti-bullying campaigns in schools. We actually created a department to the commissioner's office called the Increase the Peace Corps, where young people volunteer to get training and mediation so that they would be able to support de-escalating situations in their school. And when I think back, that sparked this idea in my mind that I wasn't impotent, that I could do something. If there was something happening that I didn't like the way that it was happening, there was something that I could do about it. And when I entered the workforce, I studied history at NYU, and I got a lot of questions on what are you going to do for a living, right? And the first thing that I did was consulting, actually, with one of those firms that supported the mayor's office. And then I went on to working in HR. And what I got in HR were a lot of people that were, unhappy with their such situation, with how they were being treated by their managers, with whether their sense of fairness around how much work they were contributing and the rewards that they were receiving. And that gave me an opportunity to think about, well, what do I do differently here? And so before I think I even understood that I was doing diversity work, that's the focus of my life's purpose. And then I officially had titles at certain points in my career as Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And all of those were moments where I was trying to do something in a system,
Right.
changing some of the policies and practices so that people would be experiencing a fairer culture and, a better workplace environment.
That's amazing. And honestly, I have to commend the mayor for bringing in the youth because as you think about like inclusion, oftentimes it is the youth that are left out, right? And they have this fresh perspective of like, why can't you just fund the like they ask the easy questions
Yeah.
long before they understand all of the I guess culture or impediments or the red tape behind it. So that's wonderful. Um, let me ask you this. When you first started doing the work at HR, at that point, was DEI sort of like understood, or is it just like, how do we get something fairer going? Because it seems that it was,
Yeah.
I think naming it at some point had power, the same way that trying to unname it now also tries to undo that power.
Yeah. When I first started in this work, diversity work, first it was diversity, then it was diversity and inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's had its evolution.
Yeah.
When I first started, the focus was interracial relations. It was white senior leadership asking the questions about how do we better interact with our people of color that work in our organization. And
Mm.
so I worked on things that were very specific around bringing these two communities together. So I did things called appreciative inquiry labs, where we brought Black managers and senior executives to talk about how they're experiencing the organization and what they thought were the best parts of the organization that they could actually leverage and create more of that synergy throughout their culture and their work environment. So it was sort of relegated to that one specific piece. As it's evolved
Yeah.
and as my thinking about diversity has evolved, I now see it as something that is part of absolutely every aspect of HR, right? From how you even announce that you have a job, where you announce that you have the job, how you go through your recruitment process, what selection looks like, when you actually have your hire. I mean, every single step of that process, how you end up promoting people or evaluating their work performance and contribution, and looking at specifically where are the places that bigotry, whether unconscious or conscious, and racism, or institutionalized oppression, all of these elements play a role in
Mhm.
changing what would have been the normal outcome had these elements not gotten involved, right? So it isn't about saying we need to hire a Black person. It's about saying, why haven't we had success at hiring a Black person? What are the impediments that we are putting in place that
Mhm.
don't allow us to promote Latinas? I worked at a company where I was out of 900 vice presidents, I was the only U.S. born Latina vice president.
Wow.
And that may not seem like a lot or like an important issue, but it certainly was for me
Yeah.
to be in these cliques. I'd go to these meetings, these global meetings, and there was the Indian mafia and the Brazilian mafia, and there was no U.S. Latina mafia. There actually wasn't a lot of U.S. leaders that were in high positions in this organization. And what it showed me was that therefore we were completely misunderstood. People didn't understand how the salaries and the how salaries are devised in the US and the costs that we have to deal with healthcare. And so when they
Mhm.
were comparing us to, say, somebody in London at the same level and trying to say, well, why are you being paid so much more? And putting that on us to have to justify it, right?
Right.
And then it looks like, what's going on? Is there something, different? Because there's lack of awareness
Mhm.
around what actually happens in the US and what life is actually like here.
That's incredible. Um, yeah, I don't think I ever saw it that way until you just explained it. But you don't, I think the greater point is like we are tribalistic, right? And so a lot of the work is you know, kind of like meshing minds and understanding each other and seeing each other and not othering each other. And understanding different points of view, right? So why does the US have a higher cost of living or perceived to have a higher cost of living? What are the realities? And what does it mean to be US Latina and not from Latin America itself, right?
and
Which
and
is
how that is different. I mean, there's a job that I got. in my career specifically because I spoke Spanish, right? And so I knew the other candidates. I knew that no one else spoke Spanish. I knew that I was going to get this job.
Yeah.
I was also qualified for the role because I had experience working with that function before.
All right.
So I felt like I was well positioned to be able to do that work. Yet, when I explained to them, the Spanish that I speak is different.
Right.
It's not Mexican Spanish. It's not Colombian Spanish. There are going to be a lot of places where we're going to misunderstand each other.
Mhm.
And I'm also not going to be welcomed with open arms as though I was a native because I'm not. They see me as American, as US, right? Estadounidense,
Mhm.
being from the US. And I don't think the leadership factored that in. Now, was I able to overcome that
Mhm.
through forging relationships and actually working very, very hard to make sure that people could see me as a person and not as my nationality? Yes, I was able to do that. But I think the thing that we take for granted is we try to lump the entire Latin diaspora into they're all connected. And we're actually not. There's some strong feelings against each other from different countries and how these different nationalities have played out in their embarking for the US and how they've been treated and how they've encountered challenges in the US. So I think what's really important for us to remember is that in any situation when you're dealing with difference, it's about peeling the layers of the onion and
Right.
getting to know where are you the same? Where are the things that are familial, right?
Mhm.
I actually took one of these assessments around culture when I was going to Mexico and I was going to work in Mexico for a few years. And I was on the opposite end of the scale on every aspect of that exam. So when it said proximity to power, Mexicans have low proximity to power. I have a high proximity to power. When it talked about being able to handle ambiguity, Mexicans have a low tolerance for ambiguity. I have a high tolerance for ambiguity. And all of that showed that I was going to be a fish out of water.
Yeah.
Where I had to have a rationale session with myself to say, I'm not here to change Mexico. I'm not going to change the machista way of looking at it, the way that women are treated, how the government responds to poverty. But there are things within the company that I can change, how HR people were being looked at, the work that HR actually focused on, the training that HR people were required to have, and all of that to make my function much better positioned in supporting the growth of the business.
Right. But I think it's also really wonderful that you had the insight to know the differences, right? Which I think speaks to why really allowing people to bring their understanding of culture and race um, into the conversation is so important. We're not, because I also am of Latin American descent. I'm Colombian. And I do know, and because I'm bicultural in that way, I understood exactly what you were saying, but I don't know that someone who wasn't would have understood it. Well, you're all Latino. Well, no, Latin America is many, many countries with different histories, different relationships with each other. Um, and these things matter, right? And I think it's honoring the fact that these things matter that I think is part of the work of DEI, right? There's this sort of sense of like we want to put a blanket of like unity over everything, and it's like you can't just jump to that step. You can aim for that step, but there are steps involved, and I think personally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's what DEI does. It allows you to work those steps until you understand how to get to a unified place that doesn't
That's
discount the
right.
difference. All right.
That's exactly right.
So I'm gonna segue on to my next question because already you told us so much about your incredible work, right? And there's some key things that you said that I think are so important that you've been at the forefront and of having these conversations inside the workplace, which I'm assuming, which I'm sure could not have been easy, especially before DEI became as understood and mainstreamed as it is, well, as it was up until very shortly. But for you personally, what have been some of your like the things that you look back on with like real pride, right? That have been real achievements despite all the challenges.
So I would say early on,
Mm.
I was working with a company that was national,
Okay.
huge company, 250,000 employees.
Wow.
And the main focus was what you would call a call center, right? A group of people that were unionized and dealt with some very strict restrictions on how they could operate.
Okay.
So, 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, so to speak, and they had to raise their hand before they left their table, and it's 30 minutes for lunch, and everything was very rigorous.
Yeah.
And the volume of calls that we were seeing in the call centers was declining. You also had a very specific dynamic where in each of these call centers, in multiple, I think in every state, there was a small cadre of leaders who were predominantly white,
Right.
and then a large group of workers that were predominantly Black or Latino.
Okay.
Um, and there was a lot of strife and lack of understanding between them. And so, what I designed and delivered was a campaign where we were educating the management of the plant, of the call center, and the supervisors, who were also tended to be people of color, on ways of listening,
Huh?
how to listen to the issue that the employee would bring up in a way of not first putting on the mask of, well, is it in the contract or is it not in the contract? But actually putting on the mindset of this is a human being who has needs.
Yeah.
And I am not familiar with the way their day-to-day work goes. Even though I'm around, I'm not experiencing it the way they do. So might they have a point in something that they are raising as a concern or an issue? So not dismissing it out of hand, but rather listening for the human elements, the part where you could actually sense somebody's humanity was being affected.
Uh,
And I'm very proud of that work because what it did is it first reflected on them that they weren't feeling that they were being treated in a humane way by their company.
mm,
And so therefore it was a trickle down effect that therefore then they were going to just adhere to the contract and hold on to the rule of law and not think about how they might make somebody's day better by just doing one simple thing, right? An
right.
extra trip to the bathroom, if you will. And so we did that. I did that work for 3 years. I actually traveled from Maine to Hawaii. I was a single young person that would just, spend the weekend wherever I was, wherever I landed, and
Mm,
then kept on going. And doing this training really made me feel like I was putting my little grain of sand of goodness
yeah.
into the world. Those sessions, that material is still in use in the company,
Wow.
and it's been quite a few years since I've been there. And I've recently spoken to someone who told me that they were trying to recreate the training session because they felt that it needed a refresher. So that was really powerful. A second similar situation was working at Johnson and Johnson, and this is where we created this change book.
Mm,
And so there were a lot of changes happening as the business was trying to grow. Most importantly, they were trying to really rationalize their plants. Many of the plants grew organically. And so you might have had product that was better served in another location,
oh,
and you needed to actually do the process of closing down one line and opening up another line. And the reaction of employees that they were losing work or gaining work, and how they were dealing with the fact that even if the change was good, that more work was coming to their plant, they still had an adverse reaction to it. And so a cadre of HR professionals, we came together and we put together this change management pocket guide. And what it has is these integrated tools that look at every step of from announcing that you're going to do a change to actually implementing it to measuring its success to keeping it sustainable. And it sounds like, oh, Evelyn, that's change management. That has nothing to do with diversity, but it has everything to do with diversity.
yeah.
Because again, this is going to be a theme, I think. This pocket guide, if you're really looking at what the tools are asking you to do, it's listen.
Right.
listen to the employees and understand what their reality is, understand what their likes and dislikes are, and help position for them so that they can actually understand why this change was happening. So some factories became specialized, right? And so they became highly specialized. That is going to support their longevity. Whereas other factories in places where it was cheaper to create things were much more generalist.
Okay.
And that was going to lead to their longevity. And so at this point, the company hadn't thought of let's share the overall global strategy with employees at the bottom line, who are, working on, very specific tactical creation of product. But that actually was at that time a bit groundbreaking,
Yeah,
because it brought in multiple perspectives into securing that the strategy was actually going to be successful.
that's fantastic. And you're right, I do see the common themes of like it is about listening, but it's also about listening because of the humanity of the other that are affected, right? So I'm sure there's nothing that you can do in a company that doesn't affect everyone down the line. And everyone deserves to be listened to because everyone there is a human, managing change, managing their lives, managing their own individual careers, and managing the goals of the company. So the more that you listen, through that lens of humanity, I think it's powerful, right? And that's a wonderful thing to have been a change maker and at the forefront of. I think that's wonderful. Now, if I'm just going to flip the script a little bit. What have been some of the biggest challenges? Because you are a bicultural U.S. Latina, in some very, very high places. I can't imagine that's been easy. Statistically, I would say you're one out of a million, probably not that high, but possibly not, I'm not sure. So what have been those challenges for you?
I'll share one of the major projects that was a big disappointment for me, and I think it came through the challenges and perhaps some things that I wasn't able to navigate as adeptly as I thought. But for a company that I worked with that was a multinational, and had a very large HR function, I conducted an equity audit. And so this was about looking at all of the elements of HR and auditing whether or not they were giving us fair outcomes. So were they actually, for example, their performance management process,
Mhm.
was it eliminating bias, allowing for people's true worth to come out, in the decision-making process of assigning a rating or determining someone's bonus, for example. So we actually audited 17 functions within HR.
No.
I had an external partner that was wonderful. They had an audit that was around equality, and we adapted it and created a new audit around equity. And so we were specifically looking for equitable outcomes,
Mhm.
fairness. We were able to roll that assessment out, and when I had the results and came to the board to share the results, the reaction of a couple of the leaders were, well, I don't think we should do that. I mean, I think that's a lot of investment of time and money, and I don't think that this is the right thing to do. And the CEO said, I'm not sure that you're listening. I think she's saying she already did it. And that was a bit of how I managed, right?
Yeah.
I knew there were places where I could get shut down, right? So if I had the budget to do it and I could get the local approvals, I went ahead and did things without necessarily having to escalate it and let people know that I was doing them. And so
Right.
then I would share the outcome and what the result was. And the outcomes were fantastic. We ended up having this massive session with the HR team where they were going to take the outcomes of the surveys and actually adapt their objectives for the coming year so that they could start deliberately working on improving where they were on the continuity of maturity. So we
Wow.
had an entire maturity assessment, and it showed, if you're a one, this is what you're doing in terms of your recruitment practices. But if you're a five, this is what you're doing in terms of recruitment. This is what it should look like. And the company as an overall was around a 3.5, right? So right smack in the middle.
Yeah.
And what it showed is we had some departments that, say, like communications, had really taken on, this idea of listening to employees and having engagement sessions and putting information out in a very equitable way, where other other parts of HR were really antiquated, and they hadn't even automated them yet, or they'd automated them based on antiquated systems, and so they weren't getting the benefit of doing things in a more modern way. And so the bad part about it, the thing that makes me feel sad, is that everything changed. So the leadership changed, my leadership changed, my role changed, right at the moment where you were going to start to see people getting really engaged in this outcome. And so the company was beginning to understand what we meant by equity. People were beginning to not be afraid of it and actually say, okay, I get it. Why wouldn't I want a meritocracy? Why wouldn't I want to make sure
Right.
that, you have this balance of diversity, inclusion, equity within a meritocracy? If you don't have DEI, meritocracies can go hugely wrong, right? You actually need
Yeah.
DEI to help buttress that and support outcomes that are fair.
Yeah.
Um, I know it sounds like, oh, meritocracy is always fair. It isn't. There's ways of gaming the system.
Right.
So this is what DEI prevents against. And so it was a huge disappointment for me that once the champion, meaning me, isn't there,
Yeah.
the situation doesn't continue. And so we had an amazing amount of work, a lot of invested employees lower in the organization who did manage to do something with their policies and their practices. But at a global level, we weren't able to say at least there was one global practice that significantly changed because of the outcomes of that work. So that was one of those. And I think it's what pulled me away from wanting to be doing systems work. I've spent 35 years working on large scale systems, trying to make organizations change by the rule of law,
Yeah.
by the policy and the practice that we want to put in place. And it turned me into wanting to work with individuals, which actually was the best part of my job anyway, right? Is talking to individuals, trying to influence people, trying to coach people through their difficulties. And that's the kind of work that I've taken on now.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it sounds like the one that got away, right? The one that
Yeah,
the could have been, should have been. But also I think speaks to the reality of so many organizations. When big changes come, a lot of great work is lost, unfortunately.
yes,
And
yes.
then to your point about meritocracy, I think this is a wonderful way for us to move into the podcast and the wonderful guests that we've had on. But we discussed this topic of meritocracy with Heather Price, right? And she and that was a really wonderful conversation because you're right, meritocracy sounds wonderful, but and like how can you go wrong with meritocracy? But then you start asking these questions like, well, who gets to say what the merit is? Like who gets to name the criteria? Who gets to gauge it? Who gets a chance to truly partake in it? Right.
Yes.
And and then the other thing is like, in terms of how much leadership is willing to invest in this work, it comes to, Kristen Kavanaugh talking about courage. It requires a level of understanding. It requires the strength to look within oneself and go, hey, you know what? These simple labels have deeper meaning and they don't play out the same across the board for everyone. Um, and then there's also, I think, I loved our conversation with Tim Weiss and Julia Stoyle, really getting, as we say in Spanish, la mano en la masa, right? Like the hands in the dirt about what is the actual work that DEI does, which is dismantle oppressive systems and the way that they show up with every human being that walks into a door, of any organization or corporation. Um, and how multifaceted it is, how complex it is, how deeply human it is, right? And how do we address that and then create an equitable system that works for everyone to the best of that organization's ability? And I also love the what you talked about. I think you mentioned data, which is with Bo Young Lee. We had this amazing conversation about data and why it's important and why in many ways um, the lack of it has sort of hampered the work of DEI. Uh,
It's made it vulnerable, in
yeah.
fact. DEI was vulnerable for attack because we didn't actually have any consistent standard of what good looked like. And so people could twist what the work of DEI actually is, and change the narrative on us.
Yeah, and that speaks to what you just talked about, that the work that you were doing at that organization, giving real metrics, like this is a 3.5 and we're looking to be at a, I'm assuming everyone's looking to be at a 5, but how do you actually create the data that gives you milestones to hit or benchmarks to know that you've accomplished? And without those things, they're just, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but just based on the conversations we've had on the podcast over the year, uh, it's wonderful words and it feels great to hear them, but they really do need teeth, right? Like it needs to have actual grounding mechanisms and work behind it that says it's not just the right thing, it's good business, and this is how you achieve it, right? And this is where we're at on that scale. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. So
absolutely.
yeah, we've had some incredible guests that have helped me because like I said, I didn't have a background in it, but I feel like I'm much more prepared now to understand the work that's being done. Can I ask you, and we've had conversations offline, obviously, about this, but what is it we would like to see happen with the podcast? Like, what kind of other conversations are we taking on that I think are important,
Yeah.
especially in these difficult times?
So I really want to continue the trend of talking to leaders and experts across multiple fields. So looking at people who perhaps are um, building DEI practices, and then also looking at people who have left DEI practices and why did they leave and what were some of those difficult choices. I really want us to be able to speak to everyone. So, not have this be a podcast that's only for practitioners, right? So, being able to set the context so that everyone can understand the conversation and be a part of the conversation. I think that's a really critical element for us right now. We've
Yeah.
gotten some wonderful feedback that people are, really learning around things like, so what is white supremacy? And, how would we define racism in a way that is more palatable and actually gives us something that we can work with, right? So we've been able to do that this past year, and I'd like to be able to be more deliberate around that.
Yeah.
So bring people that have various theories, but also continue to open people's eyes to some of the things that we take for granted. The things that we assume are operating the way that they should, and in reality, they aren't. There's a wonderful dialogue that's been going on the internet right now around illustrations and how when you see medical illustrations, they're
Yes.
always white. And that was so eye-opening to me, right? You go to the gynecologist, you go to even the regular doctor, all of the illustrated material
Mhm.
is white.
Yeah.
And, what does that mean? Why is white need to be the mainstream? And there are people working on trying to put more illustrations out there that are of people of color,
Yeah.
just to show the value and the worth of the diaspora that we have, of the diversity that exists within our community. So those are the kinds of things that I would love to see us do, bringing about more awareness and education, showing some of the differences that are going on in the way that people are approaching the work, showing when things are not going well, right? Someone that might have left a big position and what was that like? But really humanizing this work.
Mhm.
I want to bring on some DEI practitioners, so more of the people that are actually out there in the field doing the work every day. And I definitely want to continue to bring on thought leaders, those that have written books on the subject and have strong points of view. But for the most part, I want this to be a podcast that you can turn to get some insights into what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So keeping it relevant to the changes that we're experiencing. Um, it was wonderful that we could bring on Kristen Kavanaugh to talk about what was going on in the military right when we'd
Right.
had this amazing, military upheaval with the meeting that
Mhm.
JD Vance and Donald Trump had with the generals.
Yeah.
And that timeliness was just fantastic, right? So that's the kind of approach that I'd like us to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because Mark Kelly right now, Senator Mark Kelly is suing Hegseth and the Pentagon, and he's showing incredible courage because he's standing
Yes.
by exactly what Kristen said. You have to stand by your principles, and you have to have honor and courage. So,
Yeah.
and then I'm just gonna, do my last final addendum to, this coming year. I want us to keep having the same conversations, sin pelos en la lengua, right? No holds barred. Really talk about things as they are without the sugarcoating, in really intelligent ways, but that really get to the heart of the matter. I think that's really what I've been the most proud of with the conversations we've had. In no small part, thanks to the way that you bring your own brilliance to every interview. And so more of that in 2026. And
You're making me blush.
uh, no lies here. And I think 2026 is going to be important. And I cannot tell you how happy I am to do this work alongside you. And to all of our audience, thank you so much for always tuning in. And tell your friends we're here, and let's have conversations, and let's really be some change makers in 2026.
Thank you, Maria. This has been fabulous for me to be here with you. I'm really excited about what 2026 is going to bring, and I look forward to continuing our partnership.
Absolutely.